Hey guys, how's it going? It is Coach Malcolm with another video, and today I'm going to be talking about stalemates in chess. So, if you don't know what a stalemate is, don't worry, of course I'm going to explain it. You want to brush up on your stalemate skills, by all means, keep watching, and then if you are just bored and want any and all chess possible, 100% same thing. So, right, like I said, we're going to be talking about stalemate say, which you might, if you have no idea what a stalemate is, you might be thinking, well, stalemate sounds, at least at the very least it rhymes, it ends the same as checkmate, and we know that checkmate is when the opposing king has no squares at all to move to, and he's in check. So stalemate, I guess the definition is pretty similar. Stalemate is when the opposing king has no squares whatsoever, but he's not in check. So there's no moves. So it's also the king, but it's also the pieces. It's when your opponent has no moves whatsoever, no legal moves whatsoever, but they're not in check. Whereas checkmate is when they have no legal moves and they are in check. So what do I mean? In this position here, see if you can figure out how white can make it so that black, we're making it easy, right? Black only has a single king in this position. How can we make it so that black has no moves whatsoever, but they're not in check? Take a second or two, pause your videos if you need to as well. Alright, so this is very common. There's actually two answers here. The first one we'll look at is queen c7, okay? So this is a stalemate position. This queen is covering b7, a7, and b8, all squares that this king can go to, right? He has no other options, and the only square he's on is a8. Is he in check though? No, because the queen cannot move like a knight. So he has no options whatsoever. So you might be asking, does black just lose in this position? Is it just another way to win the game? And the answer is no. This position right here would be considered a complete draw, okay? Once a player in the game is in stalemate, the game is over. It is a tie game. You shake hands. It is over. So now let's just try and think about this. If we're white in this position, do we want to stalemate? No, right? We want to make a checkmate. So we'll play queen b5, and then we're just going to be able to bring our king in and have a pretty easy checkmate, right? So if you're white in this position, like I said, you don't want to stalemate here. If you're black, the idea is you go into the corner hoping that white stalemates with queen c7, and the other stalemate we have here is queen b6, covering all the same squares just from b6 instead of c7 in this case. So going forward, understanding stalemates. When you are up material, right, when it looks like you are going to win the game, you do not want to put your opponent in a position of stalemate because then it's a draw, so you've sacrificed your win. But oftentimes, like we'll see in some of our other positions, stalemate is a good way for a losing player who, doesn't really have any chance at all to win to try and salvage a draw from what would otherwise be a losing game. But keeping that in mind, right? Understanding that, knowing that, using that in our games. For the purpose of this video, for the purpose of understanding stalemates, what we're going to be doing in our next few puzzles is a similar idea of trying to find the stalemates. And it's not like we would necessarily want to play them in a real game, but it's just because we're trying to notice these, patterns. Many of these are common stalemate positions you might see in your own games. So, that being said, take a look at this puzzle. This is a very, very common stalemate. In this position, it's actually impossible for white to avoid the draw, but let's look for the move that is a stalemate and not just a king versus king draw. So take a second or two. Again, pause that video if you need to. All right, so here it looks like, white is not going to be able to promote that pawn. If it was black to move, black would play king e7, and then the white king could come into g7 and promote. But instead, they must play something like king f6, and this is stalemate, right? Again, very similar. The king covers these two squares. The pawn covers these. Obviously, this pawn is defended by the king, and these are all squares that the king needs to go to. So he has no legal moves. Is he in check? No, so it's not a checkmate. It's a stalemate. This is a draw. What I was talking about before is this a stalemate position? No, it's not a stalemate because the king has legal moves, right? He can take this pawn. That's a completely legal move. Is this still a draw? 100%. You would have been correct if you were thinking that, but it's just not the stalemate example we were trying to find. All right. Next puzzle. A little bit different. We've got a rook and a king on the board, see if you can find that stalemate for white. Obviously, if you're playing white here, you would want to go for the checkmate. You are not looking for stalemates. You're looking to avoid stalemates and make sure that black king, if he's not in check, always has escape squares. But for the sake of this video, let's look for that stalemate. Take a second or two. All right, hopefully we see rook b7 just traps that king right in the corner. The rook covers all his escape squares, and that rook is defended by the king. So, is he in check again? No, he's not in check, but he has no squares. This would be a draw, right? If we were playing this for white, it would be a much better idea to play king b6 after king b8. Just a little side note, see if you can find the checkmate in 2 here. It is rook c1, forcing this king over rook c8. So this is how we would want to play it, but for the sake of the video, again, rook b7 is an example of another stalemate position. All right, next up, I have seen this happen in so many games in all the years that I've played chess. There are 2 answers here. I believe 2 ways that white can stalemate. Again, if you were playing white, you would want to go straight for that checkmate and avoid stalemate, but let us find those 2 stalemates here. All right, our first stalemate is if this king decides he should just come in to c6. Now, it might not look like it right away because, oh wow, the king is so far away from our king and queen. But the queen covers all these squares, and by moving to c6, you have taken c7 as well. But the king is not in check, so it is stalemate. The same exact thing can be said for king d6, covers c7, and now all these squares are covered by the queen. The king is also covering these squares as well, but that's not as important. The point is, this is stalemate. So if you're playing this position for white, like we should know, we want to get that king on the back rank, queen f7, and now we will have another easy checkmate. All right. Next up, another super common way to stalemate, and this is an example of when white is losing and they want to use stalemate. Like I said, if you're losing, it can be a great way to salvage a draw. So how can white get their draw in what may appear to be a losing position? All right, so if white played just a random move like king g3 here, black gets to go to g1, they're going to promote to a queen. I don't think they're going to stalemate, and white will lose. But last chance opportunity, white can play king f2. Now we have another pawn on the board, so we're going to talk about that. But this king can't obviously move on to his own pawn, can't go to either g1 or g2 because of this king on f2. And this pawn also has no legal moves, right? So a stalemate, remember, like we said, it's about no legal moves whatsoever. It's not just about the king not having any legal moves and not being in check. It's about none of the pawns having any legal moves. So if we had black pawns scattered all over the board, but white pawns were blocking them so that there was still no legal moves whatsoever, it would still be a stalemate position. So next up, a little bit different. Looks similar to our rook position. White to move. See if you can find this stalemate. Where is our stalemate? All right, here we play, I think it is possibly black to move in this position. Let's use our imagination. Knight c6 covers b8, covers a7. This white king is covering these 2 squares right here. The knight on c6 covers these squares. Again, the king is not in check. For the sake of this puzzle, we're just showing that it's stalemate, but you may also know that a king and a knight versus a king, and when that's all that's on the board, by definition, can be claimed as a theoretical draw. All right, next up, we've got another puzzle. This one, our king is a little more, not necessarily in the center of the board, but he's not in one of the corners at the very least. So this move, again, white would not want to stalemate in an actual game, but let's try and find this stalemate here. Take a second or two. All right, our stalemate is rook f8, which, at first glance may not look like a horrible move. You're cutting this king off. Maybe you're going to come in with some checks later on. But in cutting the king off, we have taken far too many squares. The king on g2 takes this key square g3 as well. The rooks are cutting off the f and h files. This pawn cannot move at all, so that's not a legal move. The king has no legal moves. Is he in check? Again, no. You should know the answer to that one by now. So we, unfortunately for white, have a stalemate. But fortunately for you guys, are working on some incredible stalemate skills. All right, we're gonna spice it up a little bit here. I know it's a very, very crazy position. So what I want to do is I want to find 3 stalemates, and I want to find at least 1 checkmate and 1. So this one might need you to pause your videos. Let's find 3 stalemates, 1 checkmate and 1. Go. Obviously a very crazy position, but our first stalemate that I see is rook f3, okay? This king on e6 guarding all 3 of the king squares here. The knight is guarding d4, and this rook guards the rest of the squares, right? You know, the rook is also guarding f5, whatever. They can share dominance over the f5 square. The king has no moves. The rook is obviously guarded multiple times. Is he in check, though? Unbelievably, it seems almost impossible he's not in check. White has gotten a draw. All right, our second stalemate that I see is knight to g2. Again, the king covers these 3 squares. The knight on c2 is covering these 2 right over here. The rook sees through to d3. The bishop and the rook both guard f3, and the knight is now attacking f4. And that is a stalemate. All right, our last stalemate. There's probably more, let's be completely honest. When you set up crazy positions like this, there is always more to the story than at first glance. But here I know queen g3 is another stalemate. This queen comes into the position. Guards f4. Again, we have our king guarding these 3 squares. The queen is guarding everything on the 3rd rank as well, and the knight still guards d4. It looks like I was saying, there's a ton of different moves here. I think you could almost just make any move. Queen c7 is another stalemate, right? Because all of these squares are still guarded. The queen sees f4. The rook has all 3 of these right here. So pretty much any move that doesn't remove one of these core pieces should do the trick, I believe. Except something like this, because we don't want to put the king in check. And then for our mate in 1, let's just find 1 for now. It is queen e5 checkmate. Now we have the king in check, and he has no legal moves, right? Everything is still cut off. Unfortunately for him, that will be the end of the game. But we also found our stalemate, so we're learning. All right, this is a little bit different. Let me hide that. This is a little bit different. This was a real game played. This is Bernstein versus Smyslov. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing those names right. But in this position, Bernstein played pawn to b2. Smyslov played rook takes b2, which is a super surprising move. After rook h2, it looks like this is just a game-ending skewer once that king moves out of the way. Rook takes b2, but how can, this one's a little bit more challenging, how can white put themselves in a stalemate position here? All right, Smyslov played king to f3, and now if black decides to play rook takes b2, super surprising, this is a stalemate position. It is a draw for white. The rook covers these 3 squares, the king covers e4 and g4, and the pawn is covering the 2 squares right next to the king. So it is stalemate, so black's only real fighting chance is to, you know, try and keep it going, make some more checks. But if you are pretty experienced with endgames, you will know a rook versus a rook and a pawn is usually a very drawable endgame. All right, that is enough of the positions. Let's just do a little bit of a summation. Stalemates are when one side has no legal moves whatsoever, but they are not in check, so it's not a checkmate. They are an incredibly useful tool when you have almost no chance at winning and you need to just get that draw to, that's the best score you can get. And they are something you really want to avoid, especially if you are up material and playing quickly in those endgames where you're maybe up a queen and you accidentally stalemate. So even I do this in my games when I'm playing king-queen versus king. Every single move I make sure if I'm not putting that king in check, he has an escape square, so it is not a stalemate no matter what. And I suggest you do the same in your games. But, you know, that's the end of the lesson for today. That's stalemates for everybody. Hope you learned something, and I will see you soon.